Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our 5th annual CALD seminar towards educational equity, investing in the beloved community. Before we continue, if you are in need of ASL interpretation, please enter in the chat box below and our tech team will help provide the interpreter screen for you. If you joined us this morning for our first webinar, welcome back. If you missed our webinar this morning, they were recorded and will be available for your viewing soon. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as the Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society, and I am happy to be moderating this webinar along with my colleagues, Reverend Katie Monforte and Emily Newman. Our webinar this afternoon is focused on anti-racist school culture and curriculum. Along with this pandemic, our streets have been filled with voices calling for change to dismantle systemic racism in our society. One way that we can combat racism starts in schools, by what is taught, how it's taught, and who is teaching. Before we continue with our panelists, Emily Newman will introduce a short video on this topic. Thanks, Emily.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Amy. My name is Emily Newman. I'm a theological intern with the seminar program at General Board of Church and Society, and I'm so thankful to be with y'all today. I'm excited to introduce our second topical video from our contributors who are all students, teachers, school social workers, and others who are directly impacted by education policy on a day-to-day basis. And in particular, in this video, you'll notice we have several students who will be speaking on their own experiences with representation in the classroom, as well as educators who note how they have seen and experienced racism within education systems, and how we might work to implement strategies for anti-racism training within schools. You'll see the questions that we asked them come up on the screen, and then they will answer them. Thanks again so much to our contributors. We're so thankful to have their voices represented here. And here's the video.
I do not see myself reflected in what we learn because it is mainly because of when we study any sort of history, normally it is white American history, and then the only history about Black people is just slavery, and it kind of aggravates me.
All the times in U.S. history that we learned U.S. history in middle school or elementary school, and we never really covered ideas like slavery or racism or even like murders of indigenous peoples. Instead, we focused mainly on things like the Battle of Concord and Lexington or the Boston Massacre.
So often in our history classes and English classes, we are taught to see that which we learned through a singular lens of a white heterosexual male. And it's incredibly important that we give students the opportunity to learn through their own view and to see themselves reflected in the curriculum that's being taught. Whenever I was reading a book by an Asian American or watching a film by one, in class I was really able to relate to it and to get more out of it, not only in an academic environment and setting, but also in a personal setting. And it helped me better understand my own growth as a person in this society.
I grew up in a rural area that has become more of a suburb of Raleigh with the growth of the Triangle. I went to public school from kindergarten all the way through high school, and I attended school with a diverse group of classmates. But my teachers and administration and other certified staff were predominantly white. The same can be said about public schools today. There is still a lack of diversity among certified staff, and more so people of color are in positions such as instructional assistants, teacher assistants, custodial staff, child nutrition staff, and other non-certified positions.
Our schools are just beginning to have conversations about how we can incorporate more anti-racist ideas in our curriculum. But if we continue to have schools where there are only a handful of students who are Black and brown, where there are only a handful of staff who are Black and brown, our actions and our failure to take actions will always speak louder than our words.
Not only do we need to address the ways in which students are underrepresented in the curriculum that's being taught, but we also have to address the ways in which students are being targeted in the classroom through microaggressions or different ways in which they are marginalized in discussions. It's incredibly important to look at how we can better create an environment in which students feel comfortable to be who they are and to express themselves in a way that they don't feel ashamed or targeted because of their race.
I have witnessed racism within schools, and most of that experience has been targeted towards Black and brown children and their families. There are so many times that I have witnessed and overheard degrading conversations about students and their families. One of these examples is my emerging bilingual students are more likely to be brought up in meetings because teachers are concerned about their lack of progress and want them assessed for learning disabilities. This is very common within schools across the nation that EBs or emerging bilinguals are being mislabeled and over-identified as having learning disabilities, when in reality they are language learners and they have very unique and specific needs within the classroom. I've also had parents of these students communicate to me that in meetings they feel that teachers and administrators are not listening and taking into consideration their concerns. And that is if they even feel comfortable speaking up and advocating for their child. Assumptions are often made about parents' lack of interest in supporting their child's academics. The stereotypes that immigrant parents don't care about children's education is often repeated, as well as questioning the parents' background in education and literacy is brought up in very demeaning ways.
In the field of education or anywhere else for that matter. Anti-racism training is not a one-time thing, but rather a lifelong commitment which many struggle to accept, much less engage in. Anti-racism training and growth takes a deep level of self-awareness and willingness to accept that you indeed still have more to learn.
Thanks so much, Emily, for introducing the video, and thank you to all the contributors of the video. Before I introduce our great panelists for today, please feel free to submit questions during the webinar for our panelists. To do so, for those of you joining us on Zoom, you will see a question and answer button on the bottom of the screen, and you can input your questions there. For those joining us on Facebook or YouTube, please enter the questions in the chat box. The questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of the webinar with Reverend Katie Monforte. Just a reminder, if you are in need of ASL interpretation, please enter in the chat box below and our tech team will help provide the interpreter screen for you. I am honored to introduce you to our panel for this webinar. Professor Tiffany Mitchell-Patterson is an assistant professor of secondary social studies at West Virginia University. She serves on the board of directors of Teaching for Change, an organization providing teachers and parents with the tools to create schools where students learn to read, write, and change the world. Prior to West Virginia University, she taught middle school social studies for 10 years in Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Virginia. Professor Patterson earned her doctorate in multilingual, multicultural education and education policy from George Mason University. Her research interests include racial and social justice in education, education activism, critical civic education, and teaching Black and underrepresented narratives in social studies. Advocacy, activism, intersectionality, and anti-racist bias education lie at the core of her research and teacher practice. And I love this. Education is her revolution. Dr. Clea Harris is the Managing Director for K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress and a non-resident senior fellow with Maryland Center on Economic Policy. Dr. Harris brings a unique perspective to her work from an extensive career of working to expand access to opportunity through an equity lens in community organizing, education, education policy, youth advocacy, and building an inclusive workforce. She served as the first Deputy Director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans and is a regular contributor on MSNBC, the Real News Network. She is a proud alum of Morgan State University, the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, and the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Harris's research focuses through an equity lens, primarily on racial equity and community-informed policymaking. Her most important role is mother to 3 daughters. I also want to introduce Reverend Leo Yates and Brenda Kelly Fry. Reverend Leo Yates Jr. is a deacon in Full Connection, serving in Baltimore, Washington Conference. Besides being a licensed clinical professional counselor, he holds national certifications in sign language interpreting through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. He is currently appointed to the Division of Rehabilitation Services, where he primarily serves deaf and hearing adults with disabilities. His secondary appointment as a Disability Ministries Coordinator is at Emmanuel UMC in Laurel, Maryland. Brenda Kelly Fry has worked as an interpreter for most of her life. Born hearing of deaf parents, she assumed the role of interpreter for her parents even as a young child. She became a certified interpreter in 1976 and has interpreted in a variety of settings, some of which include religious, mental health, legal, educational, technical, and healthcare settings. Brenda taught in the interpreter training program at Catonsville Community College, now known as Community College of Baltimore County. She retired in 2019 after working 20 plus years for the state of Maryland as the director of the Maryland Relay Service. She is now filling her hours as a freelance interpreter and a grandmother of 4 beautiful grandchildren. She is also actively involved in advocating for the civil rights of the deaf and hard of hearing, and is a member of many national and state organizations which serve the deaf and hard of hearing populations. Thank you to the both of you for providing ASL interpretation today, and thank you to our panelists for your expertise and passion for this topic. So as we begin, a question for both of you. Did you see yourself, your community being reflected in what was being taught at school, in your teachers, and how did it impact you as a student and now as an adult?
So thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today. I first want to respectfully recognize I live in a home located on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Lenape and Susquehannock Nation. So I am grateful to them and giving all honor. Growing up, there are 2 ways that you can have a curriculum that reflects yourself. One is the explicit nature of, these are Black figures, these are Latino figures, I'm Afro-Latina, who had an impact on the development of this nation. Here is history about them. And then there is the secondary component of that, wherein those people are embedded in the curriculum. And so while, your typical Black History Month, you'd have Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and kind of the usual suspects, didn't really have educators who were drilling down and teaching things like the Maroon Societies, teaching things about ancient Africa, teaching things about the ways that, particularly growing up in Brooklyn, New York, the ways that Black Americans and Latino Americans built the city. And, as simple as Central Park being a community that was all Black, that was bulldozed to create the park. Those were not things that were embedded. When you talk about hidden figures, there were no hidden figures shared in my curriculum growing up. And I was in gifted and talented programs from K to 8th grade, and it just was not present. And so oftentimes we hear today educators and curriculum designers talking about windows and mirrors, but beyond that, it is critical that we, in the way we practice our pedagogy, that it is anti-racist at all times, that we're inspecting what texts we are giving to children. We're inspecting whether or not, if we do have texts with lead characters that look like the children, that for Black students, for example, they're not all in sports, entertainers, or in civil rights movements, and everyone's marching. Like Black children annoy their little sisters. Black children climb trees. Black children solve mysteries. Young women who wear hijab, play basketball. Asian American children can be not good at school and be grumpy about having to stay after school with their teacher. So that, you know, those are the ways that children should be able to see themselves in text as regular people and not the other. And I think all too often, going from my childhood where we weren't necessarily present at all to now with people who are well-meaning, really aren't doing the work to build curriculum that is anti-racist, such that all of the children in front of the educators are represented in everyday text, because they are represented in everyday society. And we find ourselves othering children by exceptionalism and saying, you know, Martin Luther King was exceptional, as opposed to there were thousands and thousands of people marching for their rights, conducting sit-ins, pushing against the system. So that's a long way to get to the answer, which is no, there was not a lot of curriculum at all that reflected me. And frankly, I had to do a lot of that exploration myself. And it wasn't until I attended a historically Black college university that I was able to really dig into the African diaspora.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that as well. Growing up, I grew up in Hampton, Virginia, and so it was a slightly majority Black city. So I did have quite a few Black educators. I did see them in the classroom and in the community. You know, they would attend the same church, they knew your family. But I also want to point out that many of them did not also delve into Black culture explicitly. They might have came across as an aside, like, oh, and this. And I think part of that was they wanted to ensure that we had the skills to be competitive. And so they were making sure that we knew some of the other things, making sure we wrote well, we could read well, and that we could be at the top, and not necessarily infusing Black culture specifically there in the curriculum. But that's something I got at home. So my mother was very attuned into making sure that I understood not only Black history, the diaspora. I had a map of Africa in my room. She came out of the Black radical tradition in the 60s and 70s. My uncle also was a Black Panther movement. And so I was able to get a lot of that education at home. And I also brought it to school as a young person. So as a youth, I would say, well, why don't we talk about this? And what happened to this? And that often sometimes served as a gateway for my educators to then start talking a little bit more about it. But I would say that it was, for the most part, them following a curriculum, particularly in elementary and middle school, and more so of what do we need to do to be forward, like to move forward and be successful. In high school, I kind of went to what we considered a baby historically Black college university, so a baby HBCU, so it was a predominantly Black school. And so issues of like racism and things like that didn't really come up, but other issues that were plaguing us during the time in the 80s and 90s was the crack epidemic was ravaging our community, AIDS, all these things were occurring, that social issues were really prevalent at the time, that I think dominated a lot of the conversation. And as someone who was Black, woman, from a girl at the time, and in poverty, it was a lot of issues around class that I think also played a part in that education. But I'm really looking forward to this conversation, because it sounds like we are going to dive into a lot of things that we that will help us really push the needle forward.
Thanks for your enthusiasm and for both of your answers. So the next question actually goes to Professor Patterson. To what extent do you feel the absence of teachers of color impacts the capacity of addressing racism in school? And what are the benefits for students to have teachers that reflect who they are?
Well, I want to be very clear, just like I stated, I had quite a few Black teachers and teachers of color, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they had the capacity to address racism in school or translate that for students. So I want to be very clear that that onus typically is also put on teachers of color when this is the work of all teachers, and all teachers need to build that capacity. However, I'll say that when you have experienced oppression in the ways many teachers of color have, they're able to then readily identify it, express it, understand it, be able to communicate it a bit better because it's their part of their lived experience. And so that is a benefit. I think also having been a teacher of color for 10 years and still continue at the college level, students feel cared for, and students feel that there are high expectations set for them, and students get new perspectives that they may not have gotten because I know as a teacher, I'm not afraid to go there. In fact, my explicit goal in becoming a teacher, I tell them, is to train an army of revolutionaries that in whatever field that they choose, I hope that they would choose justice, and as a part of their work, as essential to their work. And so let's talk about it. And I'm not afraid to really explain to students about racism. As you heard in the video from students, there's often no conversation about it. And so in my work, I realized that a lot of times students didn't understand racism. They heard jokes, and it was things that they know what it felt like, but they didn't really understand it. And so how can we make sure to explicitly teach that to students is very important. So there's quite a few benefits. And then I know we'll be talking about later, there's also some challenges in this work for students. And I want to say it was a benefit. I had taught for 5 years in the schools that were predominantly Black and brown, and in one school for 3 years that was 100% Black and brown students. And then I went to a school that was extremely diverse. And what I realized, there was such a benefit for me as a teacher of color for white students, like they needed to hear that. And now being in West Virginia, I asked my students on the first day, how many have had a Black teacher or a teacher of color? And they all say no. And this has been such a benefit for them to experience, and I tell them very clearly, I'm not representative of the whole culture. We are not a monolithic group. I am a person, I am a Black person, and this is my experience as a Black person. But for many students, it might be their first experience with a Black person and educator within that role. And it gets complicated and it gets messy, and we'll talk about some of those challenges there, but there's lots of benefits to it, just as it would be. But I just wanted to make sure I put out there that it's not that we're uniquely equipped, because in many ways we can also internalize racism as well. And we can also push out things like respectability politics and some other things that might be detrimental to students. But I just can't wait, because I have so many thoughts going on right now I want to say, but I'm going to hold back and wait till we get to some deeper questions to talk about some of those barriers.
Great, thank you so much. So as a follow-up question, this goes back to you. There is a teacher shortage in public schools. What support mechanisms do we need in place to recruit, retain, and develop a diverse workforce in schools? What policies can help elevate the teaching profession?
Ooh, okay, let's start with, and before, I meant to say this too. It's something so beautiful when a child of color says, I can be a doctor too, or I can be a teacher too. So also, I don't want to dismiss the sheer fact of seeing someone in a position and seeing that it's possible. But in thinking about the teacher shortage, we can start with the professionalism, how teachers are deprofessionalized in many aspects. I will remember being in DC and saying, I'm a teacher. Oh, sorry for you. It's just general, the aspect, but also the very root cause of it, teacher pay. teacher pay is extremely low. And I think particularly for teachers of color, we're often placed in hard to staff schools, under-resourced schools. We are often deemed as the patron saint of all students of color once we get into a school. So I would often have students that I did not teach or did not know that were Black and brown students sent to my class all throughout the day, disrupting my own teaching because a teacher said, oh, well, you go down to that classroom. And so there are a lot of barriers. So I think some things that some places are doing that's quite interesting is they are doing things like cluster hires, hiring a bunch of teachers of color at the same time. They're providing a lot of mentorship. I think also there is this idea that teachers of color are uniquely equipped to handle, they're often deemed as disciplinarians, which is very stereotypical, and they can handle certain situations and they don't need mentorship and they don't need to necessarily, they come with something, right? And I think that's a missed opportunity where teachers are not being supported, particularly teachers of color. There's a lot of racial battle fatigue that happens. I don't even like to call them microaggressions because they're not micro, they sit with you. I have tons and tons of stories of things that my colleagues have said to me, that some parents have said to me, that some students have said to me, and having to navigate that all while also having to consider working a second job because the pay is so low. There's also to that is a lot of invisible labor. Teachers of color serving as translators and teachers of color being the advocate for parents because parents of color are coming to you with specific problems that they don't feel comfortable speaking with administrators about or your colleagues. And so now you're having to negotiate conversations in representing a family that may also damage your role as with your colleagues, but also may lead to isolation. I think there's some issues with teacher preparation. If you have one diversity class and you're expected to now be equipped to teach in a diverse classroom, it's not going to cut it. Social justice is often not a thread throughout teacher preparation programs. There's barriers within those programs as far as standardized testing, that may, that have costs associated with them. Like Praxis test can be $150. If you fail it, that's another $150. And so there's a lot of costs associated to being a teacher that could serve as a barrier. But some positive things could be also some scholarships for continuing education, getting teachers training and support. If you can't provide it, there's an Institute for Teachers of Color conference that occurs every year, funding that for your teachers to be able to be in community and solidarity with other educators. Because the reality is 80% of teachers in classrooms in the country are white. And so we are going in predominantly white spaces. And that's not to say, oh my God, because they're all white schools, they're racist, but it is to say that there's a lot of issues with isolation, invisible labor that occurs on top of the low pay, on top of not feeling supported. So there's a lot of ways that we have to approach this.
Thanks so much. Dr. Harris, police violence on communities of color and COVID-19 impacting disproportionately communities of color is a stark reminder of the impact of institutional racism in this country. Can you share with us why education and equitable education is important to break the ceiling of systemic injustice?
Absolutely. So, the carceral state is an extension, or I should say schools have become an extension of the carceral state. And, it is problematic for our children to be in schools where if law enforcement is on location, the likelihood is if there's a disruption or something that is developmentally appropriate, even if it's inappropriate for happening in schools, that the likelihood is you're going to be engaged with the criminal legal system as opposed to therapy, mental health, mediation, restorative circles or restorative communication. And so, institutional racism, unfortunately, people think about racism as I am not a racist. and have a gap in understanding about how the system itself perpetuates racism and white supremacy. It is something as simple as, and I want to just take a step back. Culturally responsive education should not become code word for how to teach children of color. Because even in, like Dr. Patterson said, you know, in West Virginia or in Appalachia, where you have children who come from deep poverty and you can be in a classroom with all blonde hair, blue-eyed children, if you have an educator who steps into the room and wants to begin with, we're going to be saving the planet and talking about environmentalism and, you know, are oblivious that half the kids' parents work in a coal mine and the other half are loggers, that is problematic. And unfortunately, people have been thinking about culturally responsive education again, or culturally affirming, culturally sustaining, as something that is about making sure that those other kids see themselves in the curriculum. And it is far from that. That is a small piece of it. And so when it comes to institutional racism, class is certainly a first cousin of classism, is a first cousin of racism. And we can't pull those things apart. So when we have people who are not trained in anti-racist practice and internalizing or being defensive about what it means to be anti-racist in practice and can't see themselves in being a part of being in an anti-racist culture because they assume it's an admonishment of them personally, that is a challenge. When we have 80% of the teaching workforce is white and over 50% are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, other non-Black children of color, there's a mismatch in terms of experience, and there's a mismatch in terms of expectation. And when white heteronormative culture is determined to be the standard, when it's determined that you are not well learned if you don't know the canon, but there is no question about who decided which texts are a part of the canon, you are participating in white supremacy. When you are doing school plays and don't think to include gospel, which is an American tradition, when you are in Indian country and are not allowing for native language to be an everyday part of the school culture, you are participating in white supremacy under the mindset of you need to learn how to be successful in other institutions that are racist, that have institutional racism embedded throughout. And so, you know, if I take it to the church, you know, we see lots of people who are religious who have a hard time taking a step back and asking themselves, what does their faith practice tell them about people who have less, people who have been marginalized, people who have not been able to experience the fullness of opportunity. But they can turn around and say, you know, we have a soup kitchen or we have a tutoring program or any of those things. But it's then very difficult, like Dr. Patterson had behind her, you know, Black Lives Matter is a difficult thing for people in faith communities in some parts of the country to state. Now, are those people a bunch of racists? Likely not. Has there been a structure built in to separate seeing every person as valuable from your faith practice? Yes, and that's the same in our public institutions. When you have educators and school leaders who say, or district leaders saying things like, we don't talk about social justice because we don't do politics in school. We keep politics out of school. That's nonsensical because most teachers are paid by public funds. So your job is an act of politics. So anyone who thinks that they are not playing politics by refusing to speak about it must be clear that they are participating in anti-Blackness, that they're participating in classism, that they're participating in marginalizing the children and families that they signed up to serve. And this goes also in affluent communities. Oftentimes you'll hear people and I'm in policy on the national stage. When you talk about issues that the Black community supports, they will immediately go to criminal justice, and they will immediately go to low-wage jobs. And it's like, oh, all Black people are poor and in low-wage jobs or getting locked up. Now, we are overrepresented in some of those systems, but there's a large swath of us who experience racism every day who don't have those experiences. And, when you have children who are in affluent school districts whose parents worked hard to move them to a place that they believe to be safe and rigorous academics, and no guidance counselor says to their child, you should take an AP class, or let's stretch you, you can go into this international baccalaureate program. But the parents feel so grateful for their child being in those communities that they're not, it's hard to see that, oh, all of the Black kids are in the general education class and the honors program and AP program are overly populated by white children, or some cultures of Asian American children. And, it is problematic. So when we think about institutional racism and the impact that it has on children, it both doesn't require the adults to do anything different. You see yourself having social emotional learning and restorative practice, and how do we build a safe and supportive school climate for the children? How do we teach the children to be tolerant? How do we teach the children to respect one another and love one another? It rarely asks the adults, which should be the first step. What is my role in perpetuating an inequitable culture? And how am I going to personally commit to my own professional development, my own growth in this? And frankly, we've seen far too long people saying, well, you need to make people comfortable to be able to have that race conversation. But the challenge is I wake up every day Black, so I can't wait until I'm comfortable being Black to not experience racism. And we need to have bold leadership in our schools. We need to have targeted and intentional instruction in our institutions of higher education and alternative certification programs to make sure that it is an everyday part of conversation. And if you want to take it to a very conservative perspective, we leave money on the table by having an inequitable system of education. When we are not providing access to opportunity equitably for all of our children, we are leaving money on the table, because you have the person who's supposed to cure cancer sitting in a classroom where it wasn't that deep that they didn't have access to technology until a pandemic hit, right? You have another child who is going to make sure that we can attack carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or come up with another solution to make sure everyone is fed, and they're sitting in a classroom or in a dead zone with no broadband when a pandemic hit. And our budgets tell us what our priorities are, and our budgets have for decades said some children are important and valuable and other children are not. The last thing I'll say about systemic inequity is the use of property tax to fund public schools. It is, I could talk about that all day, but the use of property tax emboldens segregation and sets forward the possibility that some children have resources hoarded for them, while other children are expected to just get by and do well by what the state can provide. And so when you hear people, it's a very bootstrap mentality. When you hear people say, well, you have the same 24 hours that I have. And I go, I didn't have the same trust fund that you had. So I don't have a housekeeper or someone who can clean my home or take my kids to school for me or cook our meals. You don't get to tell me that all things being equal, my children should be able to access opportunity in the same ways that your children should. So When we think about inequitable opportunity, inequitable structures, structural racism that's baked into the system, property tax is a huge challenge. Property tax that extended to redlining, that extended to predatory lending to keep people in particular communities. But when you have communities that are saying, we're going to secede from the school district because we want to keep this great school that's inside of our gated community or close to our gated community for our children. We're going to form a brand new town and a brand new school district to exclude other children from this resource. That is what baked in racism looks like. And you can call it whatever you want, but it is racism and it is white supremacy. And everybody wants the best for their child. But I don't hear people saying, well, you can't use my taxes to pay for the police because they over-police our community. You can't use my taxes to pay for the fire department because I've never had a fire at my home. So when we consider education as a public good, use of property tax, and there's a Supreme Court case, Rodriguez versus San Antonio ISD. The complainants brought the case because they wanted the Supreme Court, where they wanted the courts to say that income inequity and structures based on income were unconstitutional. Therefore, property taxes should not be used to fund schools. Well, the court found that income is not a protected class under the Constitution. However, the dissenting opinion of the very conservative court, Justice Powell, said, in the event that a protected class's rights are being violated, property tax must be rendered unconstitutional. Well, we have decades of evidence that property tax has resulted in institutional racism. There's a $23 billion annual gap, 23 billion with a B dollar annual gap in public dollars that are spent on schools that are predominantly white versus schools that are predominantly non-white. We know that there are children who live within a mile of each other that have on average $1,500 less applied to their education than students who are right down the street but live in another zip code. So, it's baked into the system. We can't deny it. We have evidence upon evidence that it needs to be disrupted, but we also need to pull back and take accountability as an adults and think about the ways that we participate in maintaining that system of inequity in our public schools.
Thank you so much for that answer. There's just so much to chew in your response. So a question for both of you. Teachers, administration, staff, and students can be harmed by explicit racism, and I was going to say microaggressions, but now I won't because they're not micro. As Tiffany mentioned, how can we address the trauma of racism in the school?
I think first it has to start with even acknowledging that there is racism in the school. I think we schools tend to like to focus on things like kindness and no bullying, but there's not this explicit call out of racism and the structures, as you were mentioning, of white supremacy, institutional racism, and the ways in which teachers, staff, students are marginalized in schools. I've experienced this. I've experienced the custodian coming in my room and closing a door, talking about the things that had happened. And we're just having a session. All these things are happening. So first it's a school taking that stance. I think similar to what Dr. Harris was saying, and that this is intentional, ongoing work. Often schools will have a priority one year on this topic, and then the next year, this will be the priority. And then next year, this will be a priority. And it doesn't allow for sustained work to happen. Also, I think it's very important. Every year I've been in teaching schools, young people and teachers of color have said what the problems were, have said how they would be harmed. And there's this listening tour. Oh, we want to hear from you. And students and communities, they say what's going on. And then they may have a committee and a task force. And then nothing really happens with that, or the budget gets stripped from that work, and then that work doesn't happen. And so students and teachers of color are getting the message that this is not a priority. This is not something to sustain. I've done this work explicitly in the classroom with students, where often I begin the year and thinking about, and actually teaching about racism, teaching about stereotypes, teaching using tools like our social identity wheels so that they can start to think about the layers of their own life, the ways in which they have felt privileged, the ways in which they have felt marginalized in certain spaces. A big thing that I've addressed as a teacher was discriminatory joking and racial joking. So a lot of times young people are saying words that they don't realize is racist to begin with, or even calling out my colleagues. And we have to, and I want to kind of circle back to that racial battle fatigue. It's tiring. It can really burn you out to constantly have to defend, constantly have to say. And at the end of the day, it's painful. And the reason why I said that microaggressions isn't micro, because it stays with you. Sometimes you respond and react, and sometimes you don't, and you wish you had, and it sits with you. And so I think providing that space, first acknowledging, and then actually doing the work and sustaining the work, really revisiting policies, really looking at what are consequences associated when racial trauma occurs. There's often times when racist things has happened and, the student is still right there, right? Not in my classroom, because I make sure to check that, but just thinking about how are we dealing with this? And I think it's really indicative of what we see in the country, where there's constantly people saying we need to change, and there's people that may get interested but have the privilege of then pulling out of it. Oh yeah, this is really important, but something else takes a priority. And so really having that sustained commitment.
Yeah, I just add to that, racial trauma, schools can't fix everything on their own. Schools cannot fix everything on their own. And unfortunately, we've looked for silver bullets for what schools could and should do, again, under this concept of exceptionalism. If you go to this great school and you get great grades, you're going to be successful, which completely negates the context of the society we live in. I wholeheartedly agree about the word microaggression. I don't use it ever. It's aggressive, because the idea that people don't know they are being racist or using a slur, 9 times out of 10 is not the case. And so to give people the out of, you should do an implicit bias training when you know exactly what you're doing, but you have been given the space and the privilege of not having to name it, therefore not having to work on it. We have educators who are getting rated at exceeds proficiency, but have been guilty of having students complain about them when it comes to racial trauma. How do those two things go together? If you don't have a practice of teaching that is culturally responsive and affirming, how is it possible that you can get and exceed standards? So using student scores, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about this as well, using student scores to determine whether or not they had a quality education in and of itself is racial trauma. Because you have a situation, and it's classes as well, you have a situation where students are being taught by and in a context that is not their own, that they're expected to comply, they're expected to conform, they're expected to reshape all the things that they were taught growing up to fit into someone else's society. Another thing that I do not use any longer is diversity, equity, and inclusion. People say diverse and are not explicit about what diverse means. People say equity and they throw equity all over, and they find equity everywhere. It's like, oh, well, this child has this need and this child has this need. So to make it equitable, we need to have someone who checks the box of every single scenario, which is not equity. And then inclusion is a problem, because to be included, there must be somebody's space that is valuable. And when you include other people in your space, they remain the other. When we are doing racial equity work, we are creating spaces where everyone is valuable and no one is primary. So we aren't spending a whole lot of time addressing the feelings of people who do or don't want to talk about racism, and spending very little time addressing the racism that people are experiencing. We are starting with acknowledgement of the land that we occupy, and not at some point get into the genocide that the country was built on at some level. We do statewide curriculum review, and we don't allow for there to be whole states that teach that the Civil War was fought based on states' rights. And so when we think about racial trauma, there are children who've sat through 12 years of education and been told that their legacy and their ancestors either didn't exist or were a marginal part of this country. The number of people who have no idea what Juneteenth is mind-boggling, right? But there are a lot of children of color who have no idea what it is. And so when we talk about racial trauma and what schools could do to address it, it cannot happen in isolation. Schools need to return to being anchors of community where there's a fluidity of culture, practice, communing, which is what community is, with schools in the center of it, but schools can't solve everything. And when you aren't asking educators to be a part of community, and when you aren't asking educators, or let me take a step back. If you don't inspect what you expect, you are sending a message that it is okay. And the lack of teacher evaluations that talk about cultural responsiveness or racial justice awareness says that it's not necessarily that important. And it can be the topic for that year, and then next year we're gonna move on. So, we also have educators who get backed into a corner by external forces that are racist and perpetuate that trauma. You see in school districts, I live in Lenape territory, which is in Maryland, and you saw Howard County Public Schools and Montgomery County Public Schools, just the thought of inspecting how the district zoning lines are inequitable resulted in school board meetings that were packed with people using very vague terminology to say, I don't want those kids at my kid's school. I paid for this house so that my kids could go to a school without those kids. We see it in New York City, where the makeup of their magnet schools does not reflect the population of the city. And they say, well, those kids could pass the test. Yes, and those parents spent $2,000 to prep their children for the test. So those tests are assessing preparation and not aptitude. So I'll stop there, but there are many layers to how racial trauma plays out. And again, it is systemic. So absent intentional and targeted policy and practice that acknowledges it on a daily basis and doesn't allow people off the hook of, oh, we've already done that professional development, it will remain.
Thank you so much for both of you for answering the question. Professor Patterson, a question for you. How does racial bias show up implicitly and also explicitly in our current curriculum? And what does an anti-racist curriculum look like in schools?
In many ways, it really is explicit. So a big part of the work that I do and have done as an educator and in research is looking at erasure. So that's a primary, and we talked about a little bit in the beginning, you heard what young people were saying. I didn't hear about Indigenous peoples. I didn't hear about Black people unless it was slavery. And so there's also often a complete erasure. I'll give a quick example. When I taught 6th grade, a westward expansion unit in the standards, it was all about manifest destiny and nothing about the Trail of Tears, right? So students are supposed to learn that, this is the God-given right to move west, but not about the pillage and plunder of indigenous peoples along the way. And so I intentionally said, oh no, they're going to learn about this. I think oftentimes too, there's this idea, well, it's not appropriate for students to learn this and that. Also, in asking students, I would ask students, well, do you think there are indigenous people that live today? So in many ways, the way we is taught through the curriculum, students don't recognize that groups still exist, which means an erasure of the contemporary perspectives of particular groups. Also, there's this privilege of individuality. As it's been said throughout this webinar, white, heteronormative, often wealthy men are featured in the curriculum. Featured, they're mainstays, they're the main event, it's who students repetitively learn about. In a study we're working on Virginia curriculum, there were 176 mentions of white men in the social studies curriculum and 8 Black women. So if you think about that, students are getting those founding fathers, and I put that in parentheses, pretty intensely, but they're walking away with almost nothing about other groups. And then further thinking about the lack of complexity that they get. So Rosa Parks is not a lifelong activist in the curriculum. So there's this lack of nuance about the tokenized figures that they teach about. MLK is not taught about how he was vilified and hated for his stance on economic justice in the Vietnam War. And it's almost as if his life ends after I Have a Dream speech. I'll never forget when one of the students, I asked them, well, what do y'all know about Black history, 7th grade, Washington, D.C.? And they said, one student said, Martin Luther King freed the slaves. And I said, whoa, wait, well, back up, what do you mean? And I got that those were the only 2 things they had heard about Black history. So they kind of got it a little confused in that mix. I've had students from Central and South America saying, and I said, well, where do you think you enter as far as when we look at a US map? And they're like, where are we? They're never taught about. And so when you don't have groups represented at all, when you don't teach about Africa, you don't teach about Asia, and you don't, even in world history curriculum, there's a lot of racial bias in who gets represented and what gets taught. It's very explicit. It's very harmful. You saw how students felt, and students of all racial backgrounds felt when they don't hear or know something about it. But what it can look like, because I also saw so much joy, so much excitement for students to discover these other perspectives, these other experiences, oh, it's not just white men around, even, oh, women have a voice, children, youth, these are all these other aspects that were happening. And so a lot of the work that I've done as a teacher and continue to do is how can we center these voices as part of, I predominantly taught US history, civics, and economics as part of the American story. I taught world history too for a little bit. So I thought about how can we talk about this as a global story as well, because they were here, they're still here. And a lot of the things that happen really help to, and oh yeah, also talking about multiple identities, we talk about that as well. That's a part of the curriculum, and a lot of things that Teaching for Change provides, like social justice educators, social justice books, DC area educators for social justice, which is a group I belong to as a teacher there, really being able to be in community with other teachers that could help with redesigning the curriculum. But it's looking at the standards, saying, okay, what's missing? It's an exercise I have my pre-service teachers do, and then say, okay, how are we going to fill that gap and ensure that students, and guess what? Students often still, they get the basics. They are ready for this. They are wanting this. And I've done this with students as young as in 5th grade that were ready to hear and disrupt some of these notions and really, really talk about the truth. But also involves a very clear discussions and taking the space, which I would do, to talk about race as a social construction, but also that racism is real. And also talking about, this high level stuff where I'm like, this is stuff a lot of adults don't talk about. And they're like, oh, we're like in college. Oh, we know. And they're excited about it because we're actually talking about this is white supremacy. Why don't we say that? This is racism. This is sexism. This is this. And, they begin to get a language of understanding how these are systems of oppression and how we have to disrupt that.
Thank you so much. A question for the both of you. We've been hearing a lot about just curriculum and faculty and staff. And are there examples of schools that you're familiar of that have begun to achieve this change that we have been talking about?
I'm happy to jump in here. Here's the challenge of looking for that exemplar in the field. No one is doing it at the level that it should occur. No one is doing it at the level that it should occur. And frankly, you have schools where they may talk about racial justice a lot. They may engage in project-based learning that embeds social justice ideology or social justice practice into their work, but nonetheless have not inspected why certain kids get volunteered to go on certain trips, or why certain educators get promoted more quickly than other educators, or why the Black male educator often becomes the dean instead of the assistant principal for instruction. So I don't know of any school that should rightfully be saying, we figured this out. We've figured out a methodology to disrupt. Now, there are certainly schools, charter schools that are African-centered or run by tribal nations that 100% reflect the values of the community. But again, when it is one-off here or there, that in no way impacts the full system, right? That is let's pull out of the system and take care of our kids, but that doesn't support all of the rest of the children who remain in traditional school settings. So, it's really important for us to resist the urge. It's very much like in the research practice where we say evidence-based. We can find evidence that says whatever we want it to say. And frankly, social sciences have been used against communities to pathologize them as opposed to really unearth the challenges that we see. There's a question in the chat about students who are multiracial and forced to accept particular identity. And whenever that comes up as a question, I often say, what's your solution? Because sometimes we look for first order solutions that are like, okay, children should be able to just check every box that they want to check, that they believe identifies themselves. Second order would be having a conversation about colorism, about the formation of race, about white supremacy, because there's a reason there was a shift from I'm Black to I'm multiracial. And a lot of it historically was not about supporting children in identifying their multiple identities. It was about allowing certain children to opt out of the stigma of being Black. And so certain parents would push for, well, my child should be able to identify that they are also white, or they are also this, or they are also that, in many ways claiming privilege for them. But there was no conversation about how the world sees you. The world, when they see you on the street, sees a Black person. Or our society bestows privilege to some children based on their skin color or the texture of their hair. And you need to be conscious of your own privilege in that, because within certain communities, you will be perpetuating white supremacy if you have no concept of how those things play out. Dr. Patterson talked about racial joking. And I ran a school for 10 years, and a number of children who hated me catching an earful of them saying, why are you so Black? Or you don't have good hair. The eyes would roll and be like, oh boy, Ms. Harris is about to talk to us for an hour about that. Absolutely. Why is it an insult for you to talk about that young lady's skin? Or why is it an insult to talk about that young man's hair texture, right? It is unacceptable, but you've been ingrained, or it's been ingrained in you to believe that who you are is not as valuable as other people. So, we want to make sure there are second order solutions that get to the root of an issue. There's no challenge in this example I'm using of supporting young people in claiming all of their identities and not being placed in a box. But the reality and the context that they live in is somebody sees you as Black, or somebody sees you as Asian American. Somebody doesn't know what you are, so they're so caught up in, well, what are you, that they don't see you. And, you know, it is impossible for us to take singular examples of institutions that sound like they're doing the right thing and layer it across a system. If we're serious about this, we must address the system. We must address the second order change, and at a minimum, articulate that we know these things happen. Absent that, or saying, you know, these broad statements of principals need to adopt a culture that's safe and supportive and culturally relevant. What the heck does that mean? Exactly what are you talking about? And what is your institution's culpability in not doing that? And I think the last thing I'd want to share on that is, it is important for us to recognize that change is not easy, but hard work is hard. That doesn't mean you don't do it, right? Hard work is hard. The end. That doesn't equate to, well, let's go a different route or let's put our head in the sands, because we have a lot to lose when we don't do that. And it's important, again, not to just focus on the singular and not the whole system.
So our next question also goes to the both of you. This webinar is focused on anti-racist culture and curriculum in schools. We also know that students hold multiple identities, including ableism and gender identity. How can we make sure that they are included in creating an inclusive and diverse culture in schools and ultimately in society?
I think that's another case of naming things. When you are immersed in the disabilities community, you will find racism. When you are in LGBTQ advocacy, you will find racism. The number of Black trans women who are murdered annually is despicable, and it goes unnamed. So it is one of those things that you can't do as an add-on, but you also can't peel it out as if it's its own distinct issue, because across identities, there are issues of anti-Blackness, there are issues of classism. And oftentimes I will sometimes not, I don't know, I don't have a survey about how often, but I will hear disability advocates or advocates who support children who are new Americans and learning English or whatever the case may be. They want to advocate for their issues in isolation, and thereby they participate in wiping out the other identities of children. And when you think about mass incarceration and the school to confinement pipeline, you have prisons that are filled with over 50% of the population having some disability identified when they were children. All right, so you can't tear those things apart. But then you have children who have been over-identified and they were not supported and they were pushed into prison or confinement because of how adults engaged them and didn't want to take a second or third step to support the way they learn. So it is critical that we are, again, looking at these issues from a systemic level, but you know, the language we use when we're inspecting whether or not there are racial slurs or ethnic slurs, also, does this come across as, or is this in fact ableist language? Are we using language that diminishes our new American students by saying citizens of this country, as opposed to our neighbors or residents who live here? Are we excluding LGBT students by insisting that students use a pronoun that is different than they resonate with? And unfortunately, a lot of these things get discussed in isolation. So there is no conversation about the difference between your biological sex and how some people experience their identity, right? And so then people plant their flag in their pole in the ground and they say, well, because of my faith or because of my ethnic background or because of my community values, I don't believe that you're another gender, right? As opposed to making room for all of the children to learn about the world around them and to make sense of it for themselves. And that doesn't happen. So we find ourselves in the Disabilities Coalition or the LGBT Coalition or the English language learners advocacy groups. And all of those could be one child. So it is important for us to do that work around equity, do that work around opportunity, and not limit the experiences of what we think of a particular child. There's research about, again, Black and brown children in affluent schools or in private schools, and they have different issues, right? And so sometimes the issue is the Black girls are rendered invisible once they hit middle school or high school. And then the Black boys are popularized or what's the word? Exotic, made to be exotic. Oh, do you play basketball? Can you sing? That kind of thing. And it happens across all classes. It happens across all communities. And it's important for us not to bifurcate. It is important for us to name the thing because we can't act like it's not happening. But pulling those things apart oftentimes does a disservice to the children.
And I would say too, to really do this work with young people. So, there is definitely the systemic work that needs to happen. And I totally agree. This is not happening holistically, systemically within the education system. But I also look at classrooms as sites of change. And I explicitly have done the work of teaching students about intersectionality. There's all these buzzwords that they hear. They see on social media, intersectionality, anti-racism, all this stuff. But really working with them on that and their identities, really concretely making space to talk about ableism. This is not in the curriculum. However, it allows them to really do well with the curriculum and beyond the curriculum, which I tell them all the time, I'm teaching you for life and you won't get everything in this class. I'm hoping that this is just a spark for you to continue to learn and delve deeper into this. But I also do work with students on understanding their positions of marginality and privilege. So how are you, depending on certain contexts, an identity that you have may receive privilege. An identity you may have at the same time might be marginalized by some in that same space. And so having these very explicit and concrete discussions with students allows them to then be more open within the space. They begin to say, okay, well, I can kind of be my whole self within this particular classroom where they may not be able to do at home, or they may not have had given life to or voice to or breath to. But I absolutely agree with that naming, and it's a learning curve, and you're gonna make a lot of mistakes, particularly educators, when you're working with different populations that you may not have been used to. I went to a Black school. I was very comfortable and I thought I knew it all working with Black students. And then I got to DC. I said, oh, this is a new Black culture that's here. And then working with students that were undocumented and students that were, children of ambassadors and had, extreme wealth, and being able to understand that young people are really looking for, in many ways, this understanding around these very complex, abstract concepts that adults really don't grasp, but they also don't talk about. So providing that space in the classroom as a way for students to begin to process and understand these words can hopefully help them as they move forward and get older to be more of those change agents.
Thank you so much. Another question for the both of you. What resources do you recommend for teachers and parents and members of the village to cultivate an anti-racist culture?
Well, I definitely want to shout out my home team, Teaching for Change, who has been doing this work for 30 years within Washington, D.C. and across the country. They have many different programs, early childhood anti-bias education. They work collaboratively with the Zen Education Project, which is a collaboration with Teaching for Change and Rethinking Schools, who's doing a lot of critical work. Right now, there's an online teacher series going on, open to the public, where teachers are in conversation with historians on the Black freedom struggle, civil rights teaching, Teach Central America campaign. There's a whole Black Lives Matter at School movement that is a phenomenal resource. There's also a lot of local resources like the DC Area Educators for Social Justice, which is a community organization. There's also the Center for Racial Justice and Education. I mean, really and truthfully, there's a lot of resources out there that have reading lists and all of that. We have social justice books that are curated lists that have really recommendations on whether to use this or not. Because a lot of times, I think, Dr. Harris was mentioned earlier, you see, oh, there's a, Latinx kid or there's an Asian American kid on a cover. This is a good book. But in fact, that book might have a lot of stereotypical tropes that aren't good for us to be reading to students. And so you do really want to do your due diligence in when you're seeing and identifying children of color and books about them, that they're getting a full experience. So many times students would see certain groups participating, like they'll see Asian Americans are in during that period Japanese internment. We know the Jewish people in the Holocaust, Black people are in slavery, and then they reemerge in civil rights. Like there's never this continuity that these groups are existing and they're people and they're here still today. And so I think finding an array and variety of sources, and they're out there, but I would definitely recommend starting and going to Teaching for Change, Center for Racial Justice and Education are some really good resources.
Yeah, if I can piggyback on that. So I have a few ways to approach this. First, Teaching Tolerance has a ton of resources that make it possible for you to connect with the content and then use it within your classroom. But they have lots of good material around supporting educators who want to do that introspection, to do that and then undertake a practice of being an anti-racist educator. Second, I organize with a national collective called EduColor, EduColor.org. And when Dr. Patterson talks about local grassroots organizations, there are educators who are doing anti-racist work and social justice work all around the country. So check out EduColor if you'd like to be in community with people who are doing the work, and if you find yourself in isolation in your own community. Center for American Progress and EduColor have partnered to launch a website called WeBuildEDU.org. WeBuildEDU.org classifies educators, and I wanted to raise this point earlier, classifies educators as every adult who engages with children from the time they leave their home to the time they make it back home. That is the bus driver. That is the crossing guard. That is the custodian who gives these 4 kids a sandwich because they know they don't have the money for school lunch, even though their families don't make enough to, or they don't qualify for free meals. But the way life works, they probably should. Or the office manager who has this group of 10 kids who, when she sees them in the morning, she's looking out. Did they take a bath? Do they look like they ate? Was there a problem this weekend? I heard the lights were out at this one's home. Educators are not just teachers. And We Build EDU asks for the voices of educators who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other non-Black people of color to tell their stories about how they experienced the pandemic, how their practices may have changed in the face of racial tension, and then looking forward, what should schools look like to serve all children? So if you are an educator, we look for your story. Please share it with us. We are posting on that site people's short videos about their responses to those 3 prompts and just speaking to their experiences from all 50 states and US territories. But also we are asking people who are not educators to go to the site and complete the call to action. What the call to action does is ask elected officials, state leaders, and congressional leaders to go back to the site and hear from their educators who are their constituents, so that it's not amorphous, so that it's not, nameless and faceless people, but they can see people who are saying, my child has asthma, I cannot go into a building and potentially bring COVID home. Or, I live in a shared apartment and there is no space for me to teach without people seeing my living circumstances. So webuildedu.org. We love to invite everyone to the site, but especially educators to share their stories, and to look at educators as a broad swath of adults who support children from the time they leave home until they get back home. And the last thing I would say, so that's Educolor, that is Teaching Tolerance, that is webuildedu. Hey, so listen, we have these things called national museums, and they have a ton of free open source information that you can use to build out and supplement your curriculum for free. They have lesson plans, they have all kinds of things. There is a hashtag and a site called Disrupt Text. Disrupt Text will give you age-appropriate, Lexile scored text that you can use to supplement or replace what would have been known as the canon. You can go to pbs.org that has open source, free and available curriculum for you to use in teaching almost any subject. So there are resources that are free and available to you. And I think both Dr. Patterson and I gave a long litany of things that you can do immediately. The last thing I'll say is social media is a great tool to get into community and to stop and listen and hear where you might be making missteps in your practice, or have people to support you when you are taking a bold step in a community that wants everybody to be homogeneous. So hashtag Educolor, hashtag Disrupt Text, hashtag Hip Hop Ed. There are so many different places where you as an educator or as a community member or as a parent can go and just hear how people are talking about things. I wanna just wrap it up. I think I said that already, but I wanna wrap it up by saying, often a big issue with change is fear of the unknown. And particularly for people who have a strong faith practice, it is easy for you to be marginalized when you restrict your children from learning about the world around them. If your faith practice cannot be layered over the real world, you are setting your child up for a situation where they become marginalized when people don't understand their faith or how they walk in their faith or live their faith. And so it's important that we all take a step back and not think about censorship or I've seen educators who have been lambasted by parents saying, you can't teach that Joe Biden is the president-elect because you're bringing politics in the classroom. It is important for us to take a step back and to make sure our children have a strong quality education across the board so that our own values aren't marginalized and turned against us for the sake of someone trying to disrupt systemic oppression and the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction.
Thank you so much to the both of you. Because of time, I'm going to skip to our last question and then we'll enter into a very condensed version of our participant Q&A time. The question is, many of our webinar participants are planning to meet with their federal congressional members. Are there specific policies or legislative asks that you would invite them to address to elevate the need for anti-racist curriculum and culture? What should they know also on the state level, and what other ways can we become advocates?
All right, So I'm going to try to make this succinct. First and foremost, the elementary ESSA, the elementary and secondary, it used to be ESCA, it's now ESSA, is federal law related to public education. It is a civil rights law. And oftentimes people are not clear that the education law in this country is a civil rights law. It is not random. It is intended to provide equitable access to education for all children in this country who are attending public schools. So there are provisions that are called the equity provisions, and all states and districts are supposed to lay out equity plans to take a look at things like the racial diversity of their teaching workforce, outcomes for students of different backgrounds. So if you're in the Pacific Northwest and districts are not disaggregating data, you have a problem, and you should look to the federal law to say this is something that must happen, because those equity provisions require community members to be involved in the process of developing the plan. At the state level, same thing. First of all, run for school board in your local school district. You are qualified because you live in this country. Anyone should feel like they should run for school board and get involved in community control of schools. But beyond that, you should be asking your local school board, your state board of education, your state chiefs, and your local superintendents about what their priorities are as it relates to anti-racism. Asking the question in public open comments during their board meetings is your right, and you should exercise your right as someone who lives in this country paying taxes. The main thing that I would ask people in the short term to ask about are passage of a COVID Relief Act that supports dollars flowing to schools to bridge the digital divide, to make sure students and families have access to broadband and equipment, but also how are educators being trained to be proficient in remote learning? How are educators being proficient in remote learning? That money is critical. We cannot go without it. In the 2008 recession, it took half of the states up until now to get to pre-recession funding. So we don't want to see that happen with this recession that we're in, and the potential for a deeper recession as the virus continues to remain out of control in this country. So you want to ask for relief for COVID from your elected officials if you're on Capitol Hill. You want to let them know how important it is to your community and to the children and educators in your community. And that's something you can email, call, and write about today. So you can use tools like ResistBot, which will write the letter for you and send it to all of your elected officials by putting in your zip code. So those are the things that you can do on policy. In terms of advocacy, again, join the school board. Go to the citywide parent-teacher student association board meetings, or if you have some other entity that is supposed to be for parent and community engagement. There's no need for you to feel like you have to be knocking on the White House doors to do advocacy. Showing up at a board meeting is a heck of a lot, because systems have been built to keep people out and keep them out of the know. And the more you know about how your system is run, the more you can participate in community control of schools.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree with all those things. Thinking about being a part of those advisory boards, standards within the state normally are revised once every 5 or 6 years or so, really pushing school districts, pushing the state on, it's happening right now in DC they are revising the social studies standards to be anti-racist. And so it's a part of not only pushing them, but also holding them accountable. I dropped a link in the chat so that you can follow along that timeline, that process. Really getting involved also at the community level, at your school district, right? Showing up at school board meetings does mean a lot, but participating in public comment, open comments, they actually do read, well, someone reads those comments. So please put your concerns there, because it can disrupt and stop legislation. Advocating for ethnic studies. We talk about anti-racist curriculum, and this recentering. Ethnic studies has a long tradition of doing that. And so really having those spaces where students can see themselves and learn about cultures in the curriculum, and that this is a thread throughout, and it's not just a one-off class, but also having that space as well. So really, I think pushing your state legislatures, pushing your local legislation, then also, I wanted to also mention about culture, legislation like the Crown Act, when it involving hair discrimination. Like, there are also other ways. How can we ensure the National School Lunch Program is truly benefiting students during this time period? How can you make sure these federal things are also happening? Resources, like as far as the digital divide, there's so many students right now that do not have a working device. They've been given a device that was broken or was old and doesn't connect to Wi-Fi. And we're seeing that now. There's a lot of learning loss that is happening as it relates to that. So I definitely agree with that funding for technology and funding for support, and a real financial investment in this ongoing anti-bias, anti-racist training, knowing that that is not a one-off and it's not a cure-all, but actually getting teachers and providing support for them to be in community with other educators doing this work, and financial support for that is totally key.
Thank you so much for both of your responses. Katie, are there any questions from the participants?
Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson and Harris. Actually, you guys were pretty good at watching the comments come in and the questions come in, and the wealth of resources and experiences that you guys shared really spoke to all the questions that I can see here. I know a lot of people are excited to dig deeper and to watch the recording and to dig into the resources that you guys named. So thank you very much for encouraging us to advocate and to act. I know that a lot of our question participants feel really empowered, so thank you.
Thanks, Katie. So we are at the end of our second webinar. A few announcements before we close. Our next webinar is tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it will focus on preventing criminalization and harm in schools, and it will be moderated by Reverend Katie Monforte. If you haven't registered for the webinar, you can still register by going to umcjustice.org. I just want to say a sincere thank you to our panelists, Professor Patterson and Dr. Harris, for just the amount of information, the passion on this topic. Thank you so much to Reverend Leo and for Brenda for the ASL interpretation. And lastly, I want to say thank you to all of our participants for being with us during this webinar and for your passion for educational equity. Stay safe and healthy, and blessings and peace to you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.